If we really want to change the way men and women interact, we have to completely rethink and reframe the conversation we have with our boys and girls about what intimate relationships are. Welcome to the Ignited Recovery Podcast, a new way forward for anyone looking for answers but feeling left out. If you've been searching for empowerment, triumph, and purpose, you've found them right here. You won't hear the same solutions, and you're not going to have any excuses to fall back on, because Ignited Recovery allows heroes to rise and become their best selves. I'm Dr. Adi Jaffe, and I can't wait to be your guide on this journey. Are you ready to become an Ignited hero? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ignited Recovery Secrets Podcast. I'm Adi Jaffe, and I'm going to start talking today about something that is going to keep popping up here. It'll probably pop up on the episodes with Sophie and I on Wednesday as well, and will be a theme that I'm writing about for Psychology Today over and over, because I think this is really, really important to talk about. I want to talk about masculinity and what we're calling toxic masculinity and men and what it means to be men in the world. And you know, the easiest way for me to open up this story is with an aspect of my growing up. It's not everything about my growing up, but definitely an aspect of it. And something changed in my childhood growing up when at around the age of 10 and a half, 11 years old, I found my dad's porn stash. I'll never forget where it was. It was in this cupboard right by his bed. It wasn't really super well hidden because, you know, I was 10 and a half, 11, and he probably didn't think he needed to hide it or anything like that. And I found it, and there were magazines and there were movies. This is in the days of VHS. So for my millennial listeners, I'm sorry that I'm completely alienating you by talking about putting a tape in a VCR. But I swear there were these things called videotapes, and you would put them in. And I had this whole kind of ritual because I knew that I was taking something from my dad that I wasn't supposed to, but I was really attracted to the pictures and the videos. And so I would lock the door and I would turn the volume way down and I would watch these videos, and I would look at the magazines, and it would cause me to feel certain feelings. And that's where like masturbation came in and all this stuff. But it was always this interesting place between total shame and knowing that nobody is supposed to know that I have this, also because I stole it. So there was theft going along with it. Stole my first Playboy also. But also this complete attraction to what was going on in the movies. And later on, when a little bit of the shame came out, or I at some point shared this with some of my friends would come together, and like after school, sometimes we would sneak around and watch these videos together. And like I learned about masturbation from it because nobody talked to me about any of these things beforehand. So I saw the men doing it in the porn films, and that's how I learned about masturbation. And it created a really big part of what I learned being a man was like. And by the way, my dad was almost never around when I was growing up. We talked about this before. He would really be around on, Saturdays at home. The rest of the time he was really working. And so nobody talked to me about these things. They also didn't know or had gotten a sense that I'd found this stuff. And so I created a big part of what I knew being a man was like from the movies that I'd seen and from these porn magazines and videos. And this kept going throughout my entire childhood. It continued past high school, far, far into my adulthood. And it actually wasn't until my relationship with Sophie almost completely disintegrated. You've heard the Going Deep episode, and we'll have a link to that here. But it wasn't until we were literally on the verge of losing everything that I realized that something was really wrong. And at the time, we called it sex addiction, and I went and got help for that. But as we've been doing this work over the last 5, 6, 7 years, well, we've been doing the work for 9 years, but this specific work that I'm going to start talking about here now, I realized that I don't think anybody's talking about the real reason why any of that stuff happened. And yes, I'm tying it to some of my early education, but I'm going to tie it to the much bigger picture of masculinity and this whole toxic masculinity and Me Too movement thing that's happening right now. Because I got to tell you that, at least from my experience and the many, many men that I've worked with throughout my life, toxic masculinity is just modern masculinity. Now, to break that down for you, when we lived in smaller tribes and in much smaller groups, and this is also true for primates and other animals, strong men, alpha men, controlled and protected and created these little tribes, these little groups through control and domination and violence and aggression. Now, when you think about the kind of life that we used to live hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and a few thousand years ago, right, in small little tribes that had to defend themselves and protect themselves, there was a lot of purpose for that. If you didn't have this sort of alpha protection, then the hierarchy might have been screwed up. And if there wasn't the right protection in place and there wasn't somebody in control and somebody who could make things happen, then the tribe could be at risk. And then other tribes who did have this violent and aggression streak to them could come in and overtake you and kill you and rape the women and take your resources and all of those sorts of things. And so I don't know that this is the way it had to develop, but I could see that where there was definitely a role anthropologically back in the earlier days of man for control and domination. And we see this in primates and apes, right? There's an alpha, and that alpha controls everything. He gets to beat up and take women from the more subservient males. He gets the first pick of the food. He has control. And we've grown up to really celebrate that version of masculinity. I mean, if you look around, the presentation, the heroes that represent men for men in today's culture are the superheroes, the movie stars, and yes, from the story I just told you about myself, the porn actors and plots, right? I mean, think about some of these things, right? Pick any movie. I grew up, again, I'm totally dating myself, but like the Dirty Dancing movies, the Top Gun movies, the show Mad Men. If you look around at what gets celebrated, it's these guys that have it all. They're good looking, they're strong, they have the cars, they have the money, they get the girls. You take it to porn and it's just the further extension of that. It's like the fantasy version of that, right? The guy who can walk into a room with his girlfriend and his girlfriend brings in her extra friends and they all have an orgy, and then he goes to another house and all the cheerleaders bang him on the bench in the locker room while he's getting ready to be the quarterback for his team to win their state championship or the Super Bowl or whatever that is. I would argue that in many, many ways, that is not that different of a hyper extension of what it means to be a man than superheroes. Than Captain America or Superman or Iron Man or any of these heroes that we hold up. But the thing is, there's something missing from that presentation, and it is completely the absence, essentially, of emotional expression, of intimacy, the notion of asking for support, of showing how you feel about things or communicating that clearly. I mean, if you really think about it, in that context of how we celebrate masculinity, one of the biggest put downs for men is having an expression of these things. I mean, when you're a kid, in high school even, and later, some of the biggest insults for a boy or a man is that you're like a woman, pick the body part you want to pick for that, or that you're homosexual and that you're gay, right? And I'm trying to be PC in the words I'm using here, but the terms that I'm thinking of, right? And so that's the biggest put down. Why is it the biggest put down? Because the idea is that there's something in you that is not masculine, and masculine is strong, in control, etc. Now, I would argue that we live in a society now where we don't need that same violence, that control, that aggression in our current world. And so we talk about wanting to have changes in masculinity and what that looks like, but for the most part, we keep celebrating the exact same masculine stereotypes. I mean, there are a few exceptions. We talked about a few of them as we were preparing for this episode, and I'll bring them up here, but there are a few exceptions, but the vast majority of male stars are still strong. Their actions are still about control and getting what they want whenever they want it. They still have the money. They still have the cars. They still get the girls. And the thing is that if we don't celebrate something else, if we don't start celebrating a different version of masculinity, to me, this is where the toxicity comes in. Because when men feel less than, we try to compensate. We try to figure out a way to be more in control, to be more desired, to be more like those heroes that we want to be like, that we aspire to be like, but we don't actually feel represent us. And sometimes that's exactly where the manipulation, the overcompensation, and the completely inappropriate and damaging behavior comes in. Because when we try to play a role that we don't really feel good enough for, we end up damaging so many people around us, including ourselves, through aggression, through violence, through trying to prove ourselves, right? This is where the guy gets angry both at his girlfriend and this dude who he passes on the street because the guy and the girl caught eyes and looked at each other. And sometimes he has to prove himself by getting into a fight to prove that he is man enough, right? And nobody steps on his territory. This is where bosses start harassing their employees because they feel like they're in control. And that means, based on the programming we've all had, they should be able to get whatever they want. It's also where boyfriends start believing that assaulting, harassing, raping girlfriends who didn't give it up makes sense in their heads in some messed up way because I'm supposed to now be in control. I'm supposed to get what I want out of this. Or when college kids get girls drunk or messed up because they're not secure enough in themselves to be honest about wanting a connection and having a real deep, intimate conversation about what they're looking for. And that fear then becomes compensated for by manipulation. I actually think this is where a lot of substance use in our society comes in. I know it's where it was for me. I felt anxious around girls. I got drunk. Some guys get the girl drunk in order to get that same sort of effect, right? And so if we're serious about creating change, it doesn't mean that we have to avoid everything that is masculine, but it also doesn't mean that we have to keep living in a society that I will say implicitly condones these attacks and these assaults. We have to find a way for both to coexist. Like, for instance, so when I found that porn, there was no conversation. Nobody educated me about the fantasy nature of it ever. Like, my dad talked to me when we saw Superman about the fact that, you can't really fly. When boys get into the fantasy of wanting to be like Iron Man or Captain America, we explain to them that these things are fantasy. We talk to them. They get it, right? They get that you're not going to take a shield and all of a sudden be able to destroy people by throwing it around and chopping their heads off or killing them in a whim. You're not super powerful. You can't turn into the Hulk, right? All that sort of stuff. We tell them it's fantasy. We allow them to revel and celebrate it. They get to dress up like they're heroes because we've explained it. We've gotten through the complicated nature of getting boys to dream about a fantasy and yet realize that it's not real. But when it comes to sex and porn, we have an industry that is essentially ruled by men, created for men, but there's no conversation around it. Nobody ever comes up to a guy and says, hey, none of this stuff is real. Women in the real world, they're not going to drop by your feet to have sex with you and bring their friends in to join because you stopped by for a drink on a hot day. That's just not like what Tuesday is going to look like for you. And that's okay. You can engage in the fantasy, but probably don't want to spend your whole life chasing that fantasy as a way to live your life. And here's where the rubber meets the road for me, right? A lot of us listening are now parents. And I think that as parents, as fathers, as mothers, it's our job to do differently, to teach differently, and for men especially to learn of a different way of speaking. The only sex talk that I ever had with my dad happened like this. I had stolen his porn. I didn't get to put it back in place. I put it under my mattress. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, I remember the lights coming on in my bedroom and my dad screaming at me, "Where is it?" And I knew exactly what he meant. And I picked up my mattress and I gave it back to him and he took it. He gave me this glare and he left. That was it. It lasted 20 seconds, maybe at most. And that was the only time my dad and I ever talked about sex or porn or anything like that. Now, my dad came from a family that didn't talk about feelings, and I guarantee didn't talk about sex or intimacy or relationships at all. But just because we weren't giving tools as children doesn't allow us to shirk our own responsibility to get better at this. I know the pain that was caused for me in my relationships, in my life, because I had this lack, because I went chasing for a fantasy that is not true, and nobody explained to me how to really function in life and in relationships with men, women, whatever. So since I know the pain, if we don't jump in and change the conversation, our boys are going to grow up the exact same way. I now take it as my duty to teach my kids about communication, about feelings, about their own feelings, my feelings, about conflict between me and their mom, them, and about what successful and strong relationships really look like. Because I lived in that porn fantasy world for years. Started drinking so that I wouldn't bother in my own head so much about what girls thought about me. Started hanging out with more girls who were drinking so that they wouldn't bother so much and we could connect and hook up and have sex. That became a huge part, right? The substance use. Then when it got elevated and I made money and I was selling drugs, chasing strippers and as much kink as I could find in the world, because I imagined somehow that was going to be my calling and that was going to satisfy me, right? I was going to be able to live out this fantasy. And it wasn't, like I said, until I got faced with the impact that this was going to have on my actual relationships in life, my real life, that everything started coming together. The need I had to truly connect and get more comfortable with emotions and my partner's needs. And in case you're hearing this for the first time, women need more than that like porn version of pounding orgies sometimes to enjoy sex. And so do we. And that's okay. All we have to do is leave alone the old programming, leave it behind, and learn what our partner wants, what we actually enjoy, instead of listening to that fantasy version of it. Because if we really want to change the way men and women interact, we have to completely rethink and reframe the conversation we have with our boys and girls about what intimate relationships are. You know, Gandhi has that phrase, be the change you wish to see in the world. If we want masculinity and toxic masculinity to change, we have to change the way we interact with one another, and then we have to play the role that wasn't played for us earlier on. We have to explain it. We have to model what real interactions are like, including the conflict, including the resolutions, including the fact that you don't always get what you want, and what sex can look like, what sensuality looks like, what caring within the context of a real adult relationships is. I think that if we start doing that work, we're going to be able to go much, much farther downstream with changing the way men and women interact with one another in the workplace, at home, than we do by starting to find the people who are screwing this up. Now, as I mentioned, this is only the first episode we're going to do on this. There's going to be a lot more. I think we've already got 6 or 7 more planned on this topic. But I want to hear from you. I want you to screenshot this. I want you to tag me. I want you to tell me what resonated for you, where this has played a role in your life. Whether you're a man or a woman, this has played a role in all of our lives. Send this to somebody who's struggling with these things right now, struggling with their kids and how to explain these topics, struggling in their own life of leaving that fantasy world behind and finding a new way to live as a man. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will see you next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Ignited Heroes Recovery Podcast. I really hope you found the information here useful and that we'll see you back here next week. And look, I want to make sure that this podcast is the most useful it can be for you, so please let me know by emailing info@ignited.com if there are any specific topics or questions you'd like to have addressed. As usual, if you like this episode, I would love for you to leave us a 5-star review and rating. Thanks, and see you next week.